In this screencast, we're going to work our way through the standalone.xml configuration file and talk about the various sections that exist within this configuration file. So to start off with, we'll recap a quick bit of information on the extensions section here. You see the folded view of the standard standalone.xml file here. You might note I'm using a different editor here because it offers folding, but we see extensions. So this is the list of extensions that the standard configuration file has currently registered in it. As already mentioned, these extensions are effectively plugins to the core functionality of the server instance, and by registering your extension in this manner, you're also making it available to the management tooling. So the benefit of registering it, even if you aren't planning to immediately use any of these services, is that you could potentially use the command line interface or the management console to adjust some of the configuration and enable the functionality through a subsystem of some of these plugins at a later stage. Moving on from extensions, we covered pretty much all you need to know about extensions in an earlier screencast. So moving on from extensions, we have the management interfaces. This basically defines, well, of primary interest, the management interfaces. There's essentially two interfaces in here, the native interface and the HTTP interface. The native interface is the interface that's used by the command line tooling. It's a binary interface, potentially is able to be used by other clients talking to the management environment. The HTTP interface is the interface that's used by the web console, the management console that is the web interface. The management interfaces themselves are protected by the security realm here, management realm. Management realm is declared up here in the security realm section of the management interface, and you see that it's using the local authentication at this point in time. This security stuff can be updated if you wish to further lock down your server instance, but you can see that it's pointing to the management users properties file stored in the server config directory, which of course is, let's flick across to standalone configuration, it's this folder here. So here's that management users properties file, and just so you have an idea of what that looks like, the contents of that file look something like this. So here's the admin user and the hashed password that's associated with that user. You may also note that within there is an application realm that's also using local application user properties and application roles properties. That's these two files here, also located in the same folder as the management users properties file. These aren't currently active, but could be used for application security. The users for that file, for the users that are registered in this file, are registered by running in the bin directory the add user shell script here. So by running this script, you'll be prompted for the values that you need to pass in, and depending on what values you choose to add in and respond with will depend on what values get written into this file. It will also update the domain configuration files as well, so this script can be used to add users to both the standalone and domain, and for both the management and the application user base. Now obviously in a production environment or a more secure domain, you're more likely to be using something like LDAP or a more complete security infrastructure than what we have in our file-based system here. If you do plan to continue to use the file-based security mechanism, you probably want to make sure that the configuration folder is appropriately locked down at the very least, so that nobody other than an administrator has the ability to read or write into that directory. So just to finish off our discussion around the management section here of our config file, the management interfaces is a special set of interfaces that are declared outside of the interfaces section down here, and they have associated with them some socket bindings that have their management native and management HTTP, which are effectively declared in the socket binding group here. We'll look at the interfaces and socket binding groups in a little bit more detail shortly. So in terms of our profile and subsystem, there's probably not a lot of extra stuff we need to say in here compared to what we've already discussed. There's a couple of subsystems in here that are possibly worth just highlighting. Obviously the logging one, where we can set up our logging patterns and where we want logging to be routed to. Also the example DS, which is an example data source that's shipped automatically with the JBoss EAP instance, that leverages the H2 database, which is an all Java database that runs internally and runs in memory. As you can see, it's got some user and password details stored in here, in essence in plain text, so not very secure, and it's certainly not recommended for production use, but provides a data source that can be used for testing and development purposes. Typically it would be safe to remove that in a production environment and or substitute it with an appropriate one. And that's probably the main ones that we need to touch on at this point in time. Just as an aside, let's take a quick detour and look at the effect of actually modifying some values on the configuration, what effect that'll have on the configuration file. So here's the management console. We're in the runtime phase here, runtime tab here at this point in time. There's also a profile tab. Runtime basically just reports runtime statistics and values that are occurring as the server is running, as the name implies. Profile allows us to typically play with the actual configuration of the server instance. And there's a number of sections down here. You'll see profile, of course, aligns with the profile that we were just looking at within the config file. There's a number of core services: logging, deployment scanner, threads, JAMX, config admin, etc. These are core services. If we take a look at logging, you'll see that there's the root logger, log categories and handlers. You can see the console handler is here, and that was the values that we saw in the config file, and periodic was also declared in there, and we saw those values in the config file. If we come back to our log categories here, we could add a new log category. Let's add org dot what do we want? JBoss dot as dot clustering. And what this is basically doing is pointing to a Java class or a set of classes and registering those as being a category that we want to generate logging on. We want the logger to capture this any messages that occur from the clustering Java classes, but we can specify what level the message needs to be before we capture it. So if I set this to debug, for instance, which is the lowest level, I'm going to get output for all clustering messaging. Alternatively, I could specify one of the other levels that decrease the amount of detail that's being generated the further down the list I go here. So at error level, I'm only going to get messages that have a error level output or status, or fatal messages being written into the log file. Nothing with a warning, warn, info, config, fine, etc. will make it into the log file. So the higher up this list you set it, the more detail you're going to get in your log file. The further down this list you set it, the less detail you're going to get in the log file. But as an example, let's set it to error and save that change. And in theory now, if I go back to my config file here and reload it, we should see that the logger category has made it into the config file. So what this shows you also is that changes made via the administration console, and for that matter the command line interface, are immediate, and you can see that effect immediately within the associated config.xml file.